In early June, the Bureau of Reclamation posted the operating signal Lake Mead had slipped below 1,050 feet at Hoover Dam, with the daily federal table still showing the reservoir moving lower. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. The daily operations table showed Lake Mead below the threshold. The weekly hydrologic update placed the reservoir near 1,047 feet. The same federal update projected it near 1,037 feet by the end of the calendar year, and a reclamation technical review pointed to the number that matters more for Hoover's power system. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is not only a reservoir falling below 1,050 feet, the hidden number is 1,035 feet. That is where Hoover Dam's hydropower problem changes shape. This is not just a falling lake. This is a hydropower margin failure. So the question is no longer simply how low Lake Mead can go. The question is what happens when falling water pressure reaches the turbine, the power contract, the desert household, the afternoon cooling load, and the regional grid. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this map is not only showing water loss, it is showing where power margin may fail first. The next clue is not on the shoreline. It is inside the operations dashboard. At the start of June, the Bureau of Reclamation's Lower Colorado River Operations Table stopped being a background document and became the first warning light. The table did not use dramatic language. It did not announce a crisis in a headline. It did what operational data usually does. It placed one number beside another, day after day, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Lake Mead at Hoover Dam was below 1,050 feet. For most people, that number sounds like a lake level. For operators, it is more than that. It is the height of stored water above sea level. It is the distance between the reservoir surface and the machinery that turns falling water into electricity. It is the pressure available to push water through the dam. It is also a measure of how much room the system has left before technical thresholds begin to matter more than symbolic ones. By itself, one daily reading could be dismissed as a point on a curve. A reservoir rises and falls. Every large water system breathes through the seasons. In wet months, inflow changes the picture. In dry months, releases, evaporation, and demand pull the line down again. But this was not one dot. The federal daily table showed the line moving through the threshold and staying there. The weekly hydrologic update then added a second signal. Lake Mead was not only below 1,050 feet. It was sitting closer to 1,047 feet. And the official forecast was pointing lower by the end of the calendar year. In the same update, total storage across the major Colorado River reservoirs was only about 1/3 of capacity. On their own, those signals could be treated separately. One is a lake elevation, one is a storage percentage, one is a forecast, one is a power system concern. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The Colorado River system is not only short of water, it is short of operating room. That distinction matters because Hoover Dam does not sit alone in the desert. It is part of a chained system. The water above Hoover has already passed through decisions upstream. Snow falls or fails to fall in the Rocky Mountains. Spring runoff arrives strong, weak, early, or uneven. Lake Powell captures part of that water above Glen Canyon Dam. Federal operators decide how much can move downstream. That release helps determine what Lake Mead receives. Lake Mead then becomes the working reservoir for Hoover Dam, downstream deliveries, power generation, and regional planning. So when the daily table shows Lake Mead falling, it is not only describing the lake, it is describing everything that happened before the water reached the dam. The operations room sees that sequence more clearly than the shoreline does. On a shoreline, the bathtub ring tells a visible story. Pale rock marks where the lake used to be. Boat ramps stretch farther than they were built to stretch. Marinas move. Intake structures become symbols. The landscape makes decline visible, but the operational story is quieter. It appears in columns: elevation, release, storage, generation, forecast, inflow, outflow. Each column belongs to a different part of the same machine. Elevation tells operators how high the water is. Release tells them how much water is being moved through the system. Storage tells them how much volume remains behind the dams. Generation tells them how much electricity the water is producing. Forecast tells them whether the system is gaining time or losing it. The dangerous part is that the numbers are not independent. A lower lake surface changes the power system. A weaker upstream release changes the lower reservoir. A hotter desert changes electricity demand. A smaller buffer changes how much error the system can absorb. A forecast near an operating threshold changes what decisions are available before the threshold arrives. That is why the day becomes unusual. Not because Lake Mead crossed a single line, because several lines started pointing in the same direction. The Bureau of Reclamation was tracking the reservoir below 1,050 feet. The weekly hydrologic update was showing low system storage. The river basin was still carrying the long memory of drought. Federal planning documents were already discussing what happens when reservoir elevations approach the zone where Hoover's turbines become less useful and more vulnerable. Downstream states were still relying on Colorado River deliveries. Power customers were still relying on Hoover as part of their supply mix. This is the operational configuration. Water is lower, forecast margin is thinner, electrical value is exposed. Human demand has not disappeared. That last piece is important. A reservoir does not fall into an empty world. It falls into a region that still needs water, power, cooling, farming, pumping, treatment, and timing. Nevada is tied to Lake Mead directly. Southern California is tied to the river through major delivery systems. Arizona is tied to the river through municipal growth, agriculture, and the Central Arizona Project. Tribal nations hold rights, claims, and infrastructure needs across the basin. Mexico is part of the river's legal and physical system. Cities, farms, utilities, and federal agencies all read the same water level through different forms of dependence. One agency may see an elevation, a farmer may see an allocation, a city water manager may see intake risk. A power customer may see lost hydropower value. A grid operator may see less flexible capacity. A household may see a bill. The same falling lake reaches each of them by a different path. Inside Hoover, the path is physical first. Water enters through intake towers, moves into penstocks, passes through turbines, and spins generators. The electricity then moves outward through transmission infrastructure and into the federal power marketing system. Hoover power is allocated through contracts to utilities, irrigation districts, municipalities, tribes, and other public customers. The Western Area Power Administration markets Hoover's federal hydropower, which means the dam is not just a landmark, it is part of a long chain of public power obligations. When the lake is higher, the same amount of water has more vertical energy behind it. When the lake is lower, that energy weakens. The water can still move, but it arrives with less head. The machinery still exists, but it cannot ignore physics. This is where the dashboard begins to change meaning. A release number is not only a water delivery number, it is also part of the power equation. A storage number is not only a drought number, it is also stored electrical potential. A forecast elevation is not only a future lake level, it is a warning about how close the system may come to the zone where power production becomes more constrained. And this is where one of the easiest misunderstandings begins. Many people hear that Hoover Dam can still generate power down to a minimum power pool near 950 feet. That sounds reassuring, and in one narrow sense it is true. It means the dam does not instantly stop producing electricity when Lake Mead falls below 1,050 feet. It does not mean the concrete structure is about to fail. It does not mean the lights go out across the southwest because one threshold has been crossed. But the operations room is not only asking whether power is physically possible, it is asking how much power, from which turbines, at what cost, with what risk, and with how much flexibility left. That is a very different question. A system can still operate and still be losing margin. A hospital can still be open while its emergency room is overloaded. A highway can still be open while one lane is closed and traffic is backing up for miles. A reservoir can still generate electricity while the economic and mechanical space around that generation is shrinking. The map shows a lake below 1,050 feet, but the system is tightening closer to 1,035. That is why the official data matters. It does not need exaggeration. It only needs to be read as a system. The daily report gives the near-term pulse. It tells whether Mead is rising or falling now. The weekly update gives the broader hydrologic frame. It connects Mead to Powell, runoff, releases, and total system storage. Technical planning documents add the machine layer. They explain what low reservoir elevations can mean for Hoover's hydropower equipment. Together, they turn a lake story into an infrastructure story. The sequence looks like this. A dry upper basin reduces runoff. Reduced runoff limits how much water can be stored upstream. Lake Powell must be managed carefully because it also has power and delivery obligations. Releases from Powell shape what Lake Mead receives. Lake Mead drops or fails to recover. Hoover loses hydraulic head. Hydropower output and flexibility become more constrained. Replacement power may have to come from somewhere else. That somewhere else may be more expensive, less flexible, more carbon intensive, or less available during regional heat. This is not a single failure, it is a transfer of pressure. The pressure moves from snowpack to reservoir storage, from reservoir storage to turbine performance, from turbine performance to power markets, from power markets to utilities, from utilities to households and public agencies. The danger is not that every step collapses at once. The danger is that each step has less room than it used to have. That is what an operating dashboard reveals. It shows not only what is happening now, but how much slack remains before the next decision becomes harder. In a wet year, managers may have options. Water can refill some storage. Higher elevations can restore powerhead. Forecasts can give breathing room. Shortage negotiations still matter, but the system has buffer. In a dry year with low storage, every option becomes narrower. Keeping more water in Powell may protect one upstream operating concern while limiting what reaches Mead. Releasing more water to Mead may help the lower reservoir while reducing protection upstream. Delivering water supports cities and agriculture, but it also draws down storage. Generating power creates value, but the value depends on head, timing, and equipment limitations. Waiting for recovery may be rational, but the river may not provide that recovery on schedule. The calendar itself becomes a risk. The old pattern assumed that winter snowpack, spring runoff, summer demand, and reservoir carryover would arrive in a workable sequence. That sequence is now less reliable. A winter can look better than feared and still produce less useful runoff. Heat can arrive before storage has recovered. Evaporation can keep working after the storms are gone. Demand can rise when hydropower margin is weakest. The day becomes abnormal because the operating system is being asked to handle several pressures at once. It is not only water supply, it is water supply plus electricity. It is electricity plus heat. It is heat plus peak demand. It is peak demand plus fewer cheap flexible megawatts. It is fewer cheap flexible megawatts plus a basin still negotiating the rules that will govern the river after the current guidelines expire. That is why a number on a federal table can matter far beyond the dam. Hoover Dam power has never been only about the spectacle of water turning turbines. It has been part of a regional bargain. The river would be stored, the stored water would be moved through infrastructure. The movement would support cities and farms. The falling water would produce electricity. That electricity would help repay project costs and support public power customers. Low water attacks that bargain from more than one side. It reduces the stored supply. It reduces the pressure available for generation. It can reduce the economic value of each unit of water used for power. It can force operators to think harder about when generation is worth it, which units can run, and what risks the machinery should accept. The reservoir is not only losing volume, it is losing leverage. That word matters. Leverage is what stored water gives a system. It lets managers choose timing. It lets a dam release water when it is needed. It lets hydropower respond when electricity demand rises. It lets the basin absorb a bad month, a poor runoff year, or a hot summer without immediately forcing a crisis decision. When storage is high, the system can make mistakes and survive them. When storage is low, mistakes become expensive. When storage is very low, even correct decisions can hurt. This is the situation the dashboard is beginning to describe. It is not an explosion. It is not one dramatic break. It is a narrowing corridor. The daily elevation shows the corridor from one angle. The forecast shows it from another. The technical hydropower threshold shows it from below, inside the dam. And the human systems downstream show it from the far end, where decisions finally become bills, restrictions, replacement power contracts, and emergency plans. That is why the official signal has to be read carefully. The most important thing is not to turn it into a false apocalypse. Hoover Dam is not failing because Lake Mead passed below 1,050 feet. The dam is not suddenly useless. Water is not suddenly gone. Power is not suddenly impossible. The real warning is more precise. The system is moving toward a zone where Hoover's power value becomes harder to preserve. That is worse in a different way. A sudden collapse is easy to recognize. A margin failure is easier to miss. It looks like a forecast adjustment. It looks like a lower capacity estimate. It looks like an operating limitation. It looks like a power purchase. It looks like a cost passed quietly through a public system. It looks like the same dam doing less work at the exact moment the region still expects it to behave like the old dam in the old climate. This is why the operations room matters more than the shoreline. The shoreline shows what has disappeared. The operations room shows what the system can no longer promise. By the time the public sees a ring on the rock, operators are already watching thresholds. By the time a number becomes a headline, engineers are already asking which machines can run safely. By the time the reservoir feels low to tourists, power planners are already asking what replaces the missing flexibility. By the time the word shortage becomes familiar, the system may already be using tomorrow's options to solve today's problem. That is the deeper abnormal pattern. A lake below 1,050 feet is the visible event. A forecast sliding toward 1,035 feet is the operational warning. A river system at about 1/3 storage is the background condition. A hot, growing, power-hungry region is the human demand sitting on top of it all. No single number tells the whole story, but together, the numbers point toward the same weak place. Not the top of the dam, not the tourist overlook, not even the pale ring around the canyon wall. The weak place begins where stored elevation becomes electrical margin, and to understand why that matters, the next step is to take the headline number apart, foot by foot, until a lake level becomes something more physical than a line on a chart. The headline number is 1,050 feet. It looks clean because it is easy to repeat. It fits on a screen. It gives the viewer a line to imagine. Above it, Lake Mead feels troubled but still familiar. Below it, the story sounds sharper. A great reservoir has crossed another mark on its long descent, but a lake level is not just a lake level. At Hoover Dam, 1,050 feet means the surface of Lake Mead is sitting 1,050 feet above sea level. That does not describe how deep every part of the reservoir is. It does not tell you the full shape of the canyon beneath the water. It does not tell you how much water remains in every arm of the lake. It is a vertical measurement, a reference line, a way for operators to describe where the stored water surface is sitting on a fixed scale. For the public, that number becomes a symbol. For the system, it becomes pressure. That is the first thing to understand. Hydropower is not created by water alone. It is created by water with height behind it. A bucket of water sitting on the floor has mass, but not much useful falling energy. Raise that bucket above your head, and suddenly the same water can strike with force. Raise a reservoir hundreds of feet above turbine machinery, and the stored height becomes a working asset. The technical word is head. In simple terms, head is the vertical difference that allows water to fall with pressure through the dam. The higher the reservoir surface, the more energy each unit of water can carry into the turbines. The lower the reservoir surface, the less energy is available from the same basic movement of water. That is why 1,050 feet cannot be treated like a shoreline statistic only. It is also a measurement of how much stored elevation Hoover still has available to convert into electricity. The number is not just water level, it is stored elevation being pulled out of the power system. That is the part the bathtub ring does not show. The pale rock around Lake Mead shows where the water used to stand. It makes decline visible in a way that photographs can capture. But the ring cannot show the changing physics inside the dam. It cannot show how each foot lost from the lake surface changes the pressure entering the penstock. It cannot show the reduced energy available to the turbine runner. It cannot show the power planner looking at the same elevation and asking how much flexible generation can still be counted on during a hot afternoon. 1,050 feet looks like a line. Inside the system, it is a shrinking column of force. To feel the size of the loss, compare it with the reservoir that Hoover was designed to command. Lake Mead's full pool is around 1,220 feet. That does not mean the lake is normally full all the time. Large reservoirs move. They are built to store water, release water, buffer floods, support deliveries, and absorb dry years. Movement is part of their function. But when the lake sits near 1,050 feet, it is roughly 170 feet below full pool. That is not a small seasonal wiggle. 170 feet is taller than a 15-story building. It is taller than many downtown towers in smaller cities. It is enough vertical distance that a person standing at the old high water line would not be looking down at a minor change. They would be looking down through a missing wall of stored water. For a tourist, that missing height is scenery. For Hoover, it is lost leverage. Every foot matters because the dam is not only storing water as volume, it is storing water as position. Water high in the reservoir has the potential to fall farther. Water lower in the reservoir has less fall to give. The machinery can still run, but the energy conversion changes. A lower surface means lower head. Lower head means each acre-foot of water can produce less electricity than it would have produced at a higher elevation. An acre-foot sounds abstract, but it can be pictured. It is enough water to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. In municipal terms, it is often used as a rough annual supply unit for households, though exact use varies by place and conservation level. In the Hoover power system, an acre-foot is also a unit of water that can be sent through turbines. When the lake is high, that acre-foot carries more electrical value. When the lake is low, the same acre-foot carries less. The water is not worthless. It is just less powerful. That distinction is where the headline begins to deepen. Lake Mead below 1,050 feet does not mean Hoover has stopped. It does not mean the dam has lost all function. It means the system is operating with a smaller vertical advantage than the old design assumed. The dam remains enormous, but the invisible column that gives its water force has been shortened. A foot of elevation does not sound dramatic to the human ear. A foot is a stair step, a curb plus a little more. The height of a ruler. People hear that a reservoir fell by a foot and imagine a small change. But a foot across Lake Mead is not a foot in a bathtub. It is a foot spread across a vast canyon reservoir, across bays, channels, slopes, shelves, and submerged landforms. It represents a large amount of water, and in hydropower terms, it represents a measurable change in head. Now repeat that foot again and again. 10 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet. The gauge does not scream as it falls, it simply prints the next number. That is what makes the story dangerous. The system can lose power margin quietly, one measurement at a time. The public tends to notice thresholds: 1,075 feet, 1,050 feet, 1,025 feet. Round numbers and policy tiers become landmarks. They matter because they organize decisions, headlines, and public attention. But machines do not only feel round numbers. They feel conditions continuously. A turbine does not wait for a press release. It responds to pressure, flow, vibration, load, and design range. The headline number is useful because it tells the public where to look. It is incomplete because it does not tell the public what to look for. If Lake Mead were only a recreation lake, the meaning of 1,050 feet would be mostly visual. Ramps would be affected. Marinas would adapt. Shorelines would move. The lake experience would change. Those impacts are real, but they are not the deepest issue here. Lake Mead is a working reservoir. It is tied to water deliveries for cities and farms. It is tied to interstate agreements. It is tied to treaty obligations. It is tied to pumping systems and canals. It is tied to Hoover Dam's ability to generate electricity. And because it sits in a region where summer heat drives air conditioning demand, its hydropower value is not just annual energy. Timing matters. A megawatt generated when demand is low is useful. A megawatt available when the grid is tight is more valuable. That is why falling elevation can become a regional pressure signal even before the most extreme thresholds arrive. The concern is not only how much electricity Hoover produces over a year. The concern is whether it can produce the right kind of electricity at the right time, with enough flexibility and without pushing equipment into ranges where damage risk rises. The lake level becomes a timing problem. Imagine a desert evening, the sun is falling, rooftop solar production is fading, homes are still hot, pavement is still releasing heat, air conditioners are still running, people are coming home, cooking, charging devices, washing clothes, and trying to cool rooms that absorbed heat all day. The grid does not only need energy in some general sense, it needs controllable supply at the hour when demand remains high, and some renewable output is declining. Hydropower can be valuable in that hour, because water can often be dispatched with flexibility. But flexibility depends on water, head, equipment condition, operating rules, and reservoir constraints. A dam with abundant head and healthy storage is a stronger grid asset than the same dam operating near a tighter, low elevation range. The concrete may look unchanged. The value of the water passing through it has changed. This is the invisible conversion behind the headline number. 1,050 feet is not only an environmental fact, it is a financial fact. an engineering fact, and a planning fact. It affects how much power can be made from releases. It affects how agencies think about future deliveries. It affects how much replacement power may be needed if Hoover cannot provide the same output or flexibility. It affects the confidence utilities have when planning for peak demand. And because Hoover Power is part of a public system, the effects do not remain inside the dam. They move through contracts, they move through budgets, they move through power purchases, they move through maintenance decisions. They move through the quiet arithmetic of who pays when cheap hydropower becomes smaller, less flexible, or harder to schedule. This is why the phrase below 1,050 feet can be misleading if it is treated as the whole story. It is important, but it is not the final threshold. It is a visible sign that the system is approaching a deeper operational zone. Think of it like a fuel gauge in an aircraft. The first warning light is not the moment the engines stop. It is the moment the flight crew has to stop thinking normally. The plane may still be flying. The engines may still sound steady. Passengers may notice nothing, but inside the cockpit, the margin has changed. Every decision now has less room around it. Lake Mead below 1,050 feet is that kind of number. It is not the end of Hoover Power. It is a warning that the power system is being pulled closer to constraints that were once easier to keep at a distance. The reservoir is still there. The dam is still there. The turbines are still there. The grid is still receiving electricity. But the old assumption that the reservoir can keep providing the same kind of buffer is becoming harder to defend. That is the abnormal part by season and by history. A dry reservoir at the end of a hot year is one thing. A major reservoir stuck low while the system is already carrying long-term drought, reduced storage, high demand, and uncertain future rules is something else. It means the number is not only measuring where the water is today, it is measuring how much recovery the system would need before the next stress arrives. The lake is not just low, it is low at the wrong time in the system's life. It is low while the basin is renegotiating its future. It is low while hydropower thresholds are no longer theoretical. It is low while cities, farms, tribes, utilities, and federal agencies are all trying to preserve different pieces of the same river. It is low while heat makes electricity more valuable and water more contested. That is how a headline number becomes a system feeling. A household will not say, the reservoir elevation is 1,050 feet. A utility will not explain every bill change through a single lake reading. A farmer will not see turbine head when looking at an allocation, but the number moves underneath all of them. It changes the background conditions. It changes how much room managers have. It changes how easily one pressure can be isolated from another. The visible number tells you where the lake is. The real story is what that position does. At 1,050 feet, the reservoir is no longer simply a stored body of water in trouble. It is a working piece of infrastructure, losing vertical advantage. It is water supply and power supply entering the same narrowing corridor. It is a reminder that the Colorado River system was built not just on water volume, but on water arriving in the right place, at the right height, at the right time. And that is where the headline number reaches its limit. 1,050 feet gets our attention. It should. It marks a lake sliding through a level that operators, planners, and the public cannot ignore. But it does not yet show the trap that matters most for Hoover Dam's power risk. The next number is lower. It is less famous. It is easier to miss. And for the turbines inside Hoover, it may matter more than the headline everyone is watching. The hidden number is 1,035 feet. That is the number most viewers will not see first. It does not sound as clean as 1,050. It is not the line that makes the easiest headline. It is not the number people remember from a quick map, a social media clip, or a shoreline photograph, but inside Hoover Dam's power system, it may matter more. The visible number makes the headline, the hidden number writes the damage. 1,050 feet tells the public that Lake Mead has crossed another symbolic line. It tells people the reservoir is low enough to deserve attention again. It tells water managers, reporters, and viewers that the decline is no longer hidden inside normal seasonal movement. But 1,035 feet asks a different question. Not, is the lake low? Not, can the dam still generate any electricity at all? The question becomes, can Hoover still generate power with the same equipment, the same economic value, the same flexibility, and the same safety margin that the regional system has been trained to expect? That is the real turn in the story. The headline number is a lake number. The hidden number is a machine number. Federal technical analysis from the Bureau of Reclamation identifies 1,035 feet as an important low elevation point for Hoover's hydropower operations. Below that zone, the problem is not as simple as water reaching the intakes or failing to reach them. Water can still move, turbines can still exist, generators can still be connected to the grid, but the system changes underneath the word still. Still operating does not mean operating normally. Still producing does not mean producing enough. Still turning does not mean turning without risk. Still online does not mean the grid has the same margin. This is where the public misunderstanding begins, because another number is often repeated in discussions of Hoover Dam. That number is 950 feet. Reclamation has described that as Hoover's current minimum power pool. In plain language, it means the lake level where hydropower generation becomes physically constrained to the edge of what the system can support. 950 feet sounds like the real danger line. It is lower, it is dramatic. It gives people the impression that anything above that level is bad but manageable, while anything below it is the true emergency. But that reading is too simple. A dam does not move from healthy power production to no power production in one clean step. Long before the final minimum power pool is reached, the system can lose efficiency, usable capacity, economic value, and mechanical flexibility. That is the danger zone that hides between the headline number and the final shutdown number. 1,050 gets attention. 950 sounds like the end. 1,035 is where the middle starts to break. That middle is the place most people miss. A reservoir can remain above minimum power pool and still become a poorer power asset. It can still send water through turbines, while each unit of water produces less energy than before. It can still support generation while operators face narrower choices about which units to run. It can still be part of the grid, while its ability to respond at the most valuable hours declines. That is why the hidden number matters. It shows that the risk is not only about whether Hoover can make electricity, the risk is about what kind of electricity Hoover can still provide. Hydropower has value because it is not only energy, it can be flexible, it can respond to demand, it can help balance a grid, it can be there when power is needed in a specific hour, not only across a whole year. In a hot desert region, that timing matters. Afternoon and evening demand can remain high after buildings, streets, and bodies have absorbed heat all day. If hydropower becomes less flexible, the system has to make up for that loss somewhere else. That replacement may not arrive with the same price, it may not arrive with the same speed, it may not arrive from the same clean source, it may not arrive exactly when the grid is under pressure. So when Lake Mead moves closer to 1,035 feet, the power question becomes more complicated than the public headline suggests. The lake is not only falling toward a scary bottom, it is falling through layers of usefulness. The first layer is visual. The shoreline drops. The second layer is storage. The reservoir holds less water. The third layer is pressure. The dam has less hydraulic head. The fourth layer is machinery. Turbines face conditions farther from their best operating range. The fifth layer is economic. Each unit of water can produce less valuable electricity. The sixth layer is grid planning. Power customers may need replacement energy or replacement capacity. The public sees the first layer. Operators have to manage all six. That is why 1,035 feet changes the story. According to Reclamation's technical review, Hoover has a group of wide-head turbines that can operate more effectively across a wider range of reservoir elevations. But most of the older turbine units were not built around the same low-head future. The federal analysis explains that below 1,035 feet, only 5 wide-head turbines are expected to be used. 12 older turbines face the risk of excessive cavitation damage. That is a very specific warning. It does not say Hoover Dam vanishes. It does not say the concrete fails. It does not say all power ends at 1,035 feet. It says the usable machine fleet changes. That is more precise and more important, because if only certain turbines can be used safely and economically, then the dam's total power role changes even while the structure remains standing. The public may still see the same dam, tourists may still stand at the overlook, transmission lines may still stretch outward, the river may still pass through the facility. But inside the power plant, the available machine set has narrowed. That is how infrastructure risk often appears. Not as a movie scene, not as a single collapse, not as one switch flipping from on to off. It appears as derating, it appears as operating limits, it appears as fewer available units. It appears as a decision not to run older equipment because the damage risk is too high. It appears as lost confidence before total failure. The danger is not only what breaks, the danger is what cannot be counted on anymore. This is why 1035 is the hidden number. It is where the story moves from public visibility to operational capability. To understand the difference, imagine an old elevator in a tall building. The elevator still moves, the doors still open, the lights still work, but a building engineer knows the motor overheats under certain loads. Management tells people it is still in service, and that is true, but they reduce how often it can run. They stop using it for heavy equipment. They schedule maintenance more often. During rush hour, the building suddenly has less vertical capacity than people expect. Nobody says the building has failed, but everyone inside feels the missing margin. Hoover's low water problem works in a similar way. The dam can still function, but function is not the same as full confidence. When falling lake elevation reduces head, the turbines no longer receive the same physical conditions they were built to use. When older units face cavitation concerns, operators have to think about damage, maintenance, and long-term reliability. When fewer units can operate under favorable conditions, the grid loses part of the dam's historical flexibility. The public question is, will Hoover still produce power? The operational question is, how much useful power can Hoover provide without hurting itself? That question is harder. It is also more honest. This is not just a falling lake. This is a hydropower margin failure. The word margin is the key. Margin is the space between normal operation and trouble. It is the extra capacity that lets a system absorb a hot week, a bad forecast, a plant outage, a transmission problem, or an unexpected surge in demand. Margin is why a system can bend without breaking. When margin disappears, the system may still look intact from the outside, but every decision becomes tighter. A water manager has less room to balance deliveries and storage. A power planner has less room to count on cheap, flexible hydropower. A maintenance team has less room to risk running older machines under damaging conditions. A public power customer has less room to avoid buying replacement power. A household has less room when costs rise or reliability tightens during heat. The hidden number is where these margins begin to overlap. It is not only an engineering threshold, it is a point where water policy, power economics, machine design, and human demand begin to touch the same nerve. That is what makes it more dangerous than the headline. 1,050 feet is visible enough to create alarm, but 1,035 feet is technical enough to be ignored until the consequences are already moving through the system. A number can be dangerous because it is dramatic. A number can also be dangerous because it is quiet. 1035 is quiet. It sits in planning documents. It appears in technical language. It is surrounded by words like optimization, cavitation, unit availability, and power pool. It does not produce the same emotional force as a cracked lake bed or an exposed boat ramp. It does not look like disaster footage. It does not give cameras an easy image, but it reaches deeper into the machine. Below that point, the system is not only asking whether there is water, it is asking whether the water still arrives with enough head to justify the risk and cost of running the equipment that Hoover has relied on for decades. This is where the reservoir stops being only a reservoir. It becomes a test of design assumptions. Hoover Dam was built for a river system that people believed could be controlled through massive storage. The dam's power plant was part of that vision. Store the water, release the water, capture the falling energy, sell the power, use the project to support growth, agriculture, cities, and public infrastructure. That bargain depends on stored height. When the height shrinks, the bargain weakens. The concrete wall can still be there. The generators can still be installed. The transmission system can still be connected. The legal contracts can still exist. But if the stored elevation falls into a range where fewer turbines are usable, less energy is extracted, and greater replacement power is needed, then the system is not doing the same work it once did. It is the same infrastructure under a different climate load. That is the hidden mechanism beginning to show. Lake Mead below 1,050 feet tells us the reservoir is low. Lake Mead approaching 1,035 feet tells us the dam's power system may be entering a narrower operating corridor. The first number describes the surface. The second describes the stress beneath it. The The surface is easy to film, the stress is easier to miss. But the stress is where the next part of the story begins, because 1,035 feet is not magic. It is not a curse written into the wall of the dam, it is the visible edge of a physical process. Falling water pressure, reduced head, changing turbine performance, cavitation risk, lost flexibility, replacement power. To understand why the hidden number matters, the story has to move from the gauge into the machine. The mechanism begins above the reservoir surface, but it does not end there. It travels through the intake tower, down the penstock, across spinning metal, into a generator, through a transformer, across the grid, and finally into a room where somebody is waiting for the air conditioner to catch up. The mechanism begins above the lake, long before the water reaches Hoover Dam. It begins in the high country where the Colorado River system gets much of its stored future. Snow accumulates in the mountains. The snowpack waits through winter. Then temperature, wind, sunlight, soil moisture, and spring storms decide how much of that frozen storage becomes runoff. Not every inch of snow becomes usable water. Some melts into dry soil, some evaporates, some is taken up before it ever becomes streamflow, some arrives earlier than the system was built to expect. By the time water enters the major reservoirs, the first part of the power story has already been written. That is the first hidden turn. Hoover Dam does not make electricity only from the water sitting in front of it. It makes electricity from an entire upstream sequence. Snow becomes runoff. Runoff becomes reservoir storage becomes elevation becomes head becomes pressure becomes turbine motion becomes electricity becomes grid margin. Break the sequence anywhere, and the power system feels it later. The public sees the lake, the machine receives the physics. The main mechanism is falling hydraulic head. Hydraulic head sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Water at a higher elevation has more potential energy because gravity can pull it farther downward. At a dam, that height difference is what lets water move with force through pipes and turbines. A high reservoir gives the water more push. A low reservoir gives it less. The dam does not only need water, it needs water with height behind it. That is why Lake Mead falling below 1,050 feet matters before the lake reaches any final power cutoff. The water surface has moved downward. The distance available for falling water has been shortened. The dam is still there, the intakes are still there, the turbines are still there, but the invisible force feeding them is weaker than it used to be. A falling lake does not remove the power plant from the wall. It removes some of the pressure from the water. This is the quiet conversion that turns drought into grid risk. Drought first appears as missing water, then it appears as lower storage. Then it appears as reduced hydraulic head. Then it appears as less energy from each unit of water. Then it appears as a planning problem for people who have to supply electricity at the hour demand is highest. At the shoreline, the change looks slow. Inside the dam, the change is direct. Water enters Hoover through intake towers. From there, it moves into large pipes called penstocks. These pipes carry the water downward and inward toward the turbines. As the water moves, gravity and pressure turn stored elevation into motion. The water is guided through gates that control flow. It strikes the turbine runner. The runner spins. That spinning motion turns a generator. The generator produces electricity. Transformers prepare that electricity for transmission. Lines carry it out into the regional power system. That entire chain depends on the conditions at the start. If the reservoir surface is high, the water enters with stronger head. If the reservoir surface is lower, the water enters with weaker head. The same dam is now working with a smaller vertical engine. This is why the gauge matters. The lake falls slowly on the gauge. The machine feels it instantly as lost head. There is no need to imagine the dam suddenly failing. That is not the mechanism. The more realistic concern is less dramatic and more operational. Lower head can reduce the amount of power that can be generated from the same flow of water. It can change which units are efficient to run. It can narrow the operating range. It can make some turbines more vulnerable to damaging conditions. It can force planners to look for replacement electricity. A system can look normal from the outside while losing capability inside. That is what makes infrastructure risk hard to see. The second part of the mechanism is cavitation. Cavitation is what happens when pressure conditions inside moving water allow tiny vapor bubbles to form and then collapse. These are not harmless bubbles like foam on a lake. They can collapse with force against metal surfaces. Over time, that repeated collapse can pit, erode, and damage turbine parts. The easiest image is a tiny hammer made of water and pressure. One bubble is small, millions of bubbles, forming and collapsing again and again near a turbine surface, can become a mechanical threat. Cavitation is not unique to Hoover. It is a known concern in pumps, propellers, hydraulic machinery, and turbines. Whenever water is moving fast through complex shapes and pressure changes suddenly, engineers have to think about it. Turbine blades are designed to operate within certain ranges. If the conditions move too far from those ranges, damage risk rises. That is why the 1035-foot number matters. According to Reclamation Technical Analysis, below that elevation, the older high-head turbine units at Hoover face concern from excessive cavitation damage, while the wide-head turbines are better suited to lower-head operation. That does not mean every machine breaks at the same instant. It means operators cannot treat all turbine units as equally available under low reservoir conditions. The mechanism is not one switch. It is a narrowing set of safe choices. Imagine holding a garden hose high above the ground. The water falls with more force. Lower the hose, and the stream still flows, but the force changes. Now imagine that instead of watering a plant, the stream has to spin precision machinery inside a massive power plant. The difference in force matters, the angle matters, the pressure matters, the shape of the machinery matters, the speed matters. The way the water leaves the runner matters. Hydropower looks simple from a distance. Water goes in, electricity comes out, but inside the machine, it is a negotiation between flow, pressure, metal, vibration, and timing. When Mead was higher, Hoover had more hydraulic head to work with. As Mead drops, the plant operates with less. Some turbines can handle a wider range, others are more limited. The older machines may still be physically present, but the question becomes whether running them under low head conditions is worth the damage risk. That is where drought becomes a maintenance problem, not just a water problem, not just a power problem, a maintenance problem. If a turbine is damaged, it is not repaired by hope. It requires inspection, downtime, parts, labor, planning, and money. If operators avoid damage by not running certain units, the system loses capacity before anything physically breaks. Either path has a cost. Run too hard, and the machinery may suffer. Hold back, and the grid loses available hydropower. The water level has entered the machine room. This is the operational trap. People often imagine risk as a shortage of water reaching the dam, but here the more immediate issue is water reaching the dam with less usable force and creating less favorable conditions for older equipment. The lake can still contain water, the dam can still pass water, the river can still move, but the power plant may not be able to behave like the old power plant. That is the difference between presence and performance. Hoover Dam remains present. The question is performance. How much power can it provide? How fast can it respond? Which turbines can be used? How much does each unit of water produce? What does it cost to replace the missing flexibility? What happens when the grid asks for power during a hot evening and the dam has less margin than the system expected? This is how the mechanism travels outward. First, a low runoff year weakens storage. Then low storage lowers the surface of Mead. Then lower Mead reduces hydraulic head. Then reduced head lowers hydropower output per unit of water and changes turbine operating conditions. Then cavitation risk limits which units can be used safely. Then fewer usable units reduce flexibility. Then the power system needs replacement energy or replacement capacity. Then the cost and reliability question moves from the dam into the region. No single step has to look catastrophic. Together, they form a chain. That chain is why the story cannot stop at the lake surface. A reservoir is not a bowl of water sitting apart from society. It is a working part of an engineered system. It stores water for later. It shapes releases. It generates power. It supports contracts. It gives managers time. When the reservoir falls, it is not only volume that disappears, time disappears, flexibility disappears, cheap options disappear. The mechanism strips away options. That is the real damage. At first, operators can adapt with routine changes. They can schedule generation differently. They can use the units best suited to current conditions. They can coordinate releases. They can buy or arrange replacement power. They can update forecasts. But each adaptation uses margin. If the lake stays low, Adaptation becomes the new baseline. The system no longer asks how to get through one bad week. It asks how to operate for months or years with less head, less storage, and less confidence in recovery. That is when the physical mechanism becomes institutional. The turbine feels lower head, the utility feels lower availability, the power customer feels higher uncertainty, the water agency feels fewer options, the household eventually feels cost, heat, or reliability pressure. This is why the mechanism has to be followed all the way through, from atmosphere to snowpack, from snowpack to runoff, from runoff to POW, from POW to release decisions, from releases to Mead, from Mead to hydraulic head, from hydraulic head to turbine efficiency, from turbine efficiency to cavitation risk, from cavitation risk to unit availability, from unit availability to grid margin, from grid margin to a room where someone expects the air conditioner to work. The mechanism begins above the reservoir. It ends inside daily life. A person does not need to know the word cavitation to be affected by it. A person does not need to see a turbine blade to live inside a power system that depends on one. A person does not need to read reclamation technical documents to experience the cost of replacement power when a cheap federal hydropower resource becomes less flexible. That is the hard thing about infrastructure. The most important part is often invisible until it is missing. A working turbine is invisible to the person using electricity. A healthy transformer is invisible. A balanced grid is invisible. Stored reservoir head is invisible. Margin is invisible. Then the weather gets hot, the system gets tight, bills rise, replacement power is needed, and suddenly the invisible becomes personal. That is how a falling lake crosses into the body. Not directly, not immediately, not through a single dramatic moment. It crosses through systems. The lake falls, the head weakens, the turbine range narrows, the grid loses flexibility, the utility adjusts, the cost moves. The thermostat becomes a decision, the room becomes harder to cool, sleep becomes lighter, health becomes more fragile. The dam is hundreds of miles from many people it affects, but the mechanism does not care about distance. Electricity is a networked product. Water storage is a network decision. A low reservoir in one place can change operating conditions in another. A turbine limitation can become a market purchase. A market purchase can become a public budget issue. A budget issue can become a household pressure. The path is long, but it is real. This is why it is not enough to say Lake Mead is low. Low compared to what? Low for whom? Low against which threshold? Low with what machinery? Low during which season? Low while the grid needs what kind of power? Those questions turn a weather and water story into an operational investigation. They also keep the story honest. The mechanism does not say Hoover Dam is finished. It does not say power disappears at 1,050 feet. It does not say every household bill will suddenly rise because of one lake reading. It says something more specific. A falling reservoir reduces head. Reduced head changes hydropower performance. Low head conditions can increase equipment risk for certain turbines. That can reduce usable power margin. And in a hot, growing, water-stressed region, lost margin matters. Precision makes the warning stronger. The warning does not need exaggeration. Physics is enough. Water has mass. Elevation gives it potential energy. The dam converts that energy into electricity. Lower elevation reduces the energy available. Machinery has operating ranges. Push machinery outside its best range, and efficiency and damage risk change. Grid systems depend on available capacity at specific times. Remove flexible capacity, and something else must take its place. That is the entire story in mechanical form. But the mechanical form is still not the human form. The human form begins when the grid needs power at the hour people are hottest. It begins when a desert apartment has absorbed sunlight through walls and windows all day. It begins when an older person waits for the room to cool. It begins when a parent decides whether to lower the thermostat or protect the monthly bill. It begins when a worker comes home dehydrated from an outdoor shift and needs sleep before the next one. It begins when the power system has to meet all those needs at once. That is where the next part of the story has to go. The mechanism begins in the water, but it does not end at the dam. It moves through a person. The body does not experience a reservoir level as a graph. It experiences it as a room that will not cool fast enough. That is where the mechanism becomes human, not at the dam, not inside a federal table, not in a technical appendix where turbine units are sorted by head range and cavitation risk. The mechanism becomes human when falling reservoir pressure, lost hydropower margin, and desert heat pass through the electrical system and arrive inside a place where somebody has to live. Picture an apartment on the edge of the Las Vegas Valley, not far from where Lake Mead becomes more than a name on a map. It is late afternoon. The sun has been on the walls for hours. The parking lot is still radiating heat. The glass has been holding light. The roof has stored the day. The air outside is not simply warm. It is a load pressing against the building. Inside, an older man comes home after a shift that began before sunrise. He has spent the day moving between outdoor heat and brief patches of shade. His shirt is dry now, but only because the sweat has already left him. He opens the apartment door and feels the heat that built up while he was gone. The thermostat says the room is too hot. That number does not mention Lake Mead. It does not mention Hoover Dam. It does not mention hydraulic head. But the path is there. Outside, the regional grid is approaching the hour when cooling demand remains high and solar generation begins to fade. Across thousands of homes, apartments, stores, hospitals, warehouses, casinos, schools, and water facilities, air conditioners are asking the system for power at the same time. The demand is not emotional. It is electrical. Compressor after compressor switches on because heat has moved through walls, roofs, asphalt, and glass. This is where hydropower has value. Hoover Dam power is not the only electricity in the region. It is not a magic switch for every air conditioner. The grid is larger than one dam. It includes natural gas plants, solar farms, imports, transmission lines, batteries, market purchases, demand programs, and many local decisions. But Hoover has historically mattered because stored water can provide controllable power. It can be part of the supply that helps meet demand when timing matters. Timing is the human part of electricity. A kilowatt hour at midnight is not the same as a kilowatt hour during a hot evening peak. The physical unit may be the same, but the system need is different. In the evening, when people come home and buildings are still hot, electricity is not abstract. It is cooling, refrigeration, medical equipment, elevators, water pumps, traffic lights, communication systems, and sleep. When Hoover has less hydropower margin, that timing becomes harder to protect. The apartment does not know why. The body only feels delay. The man lowers the thermostat by a few degrees. The air conditioner starts, but the room does not cool immediately. It has to pull heat out of the air, the walls, the furniture, the kitchen, and the bedroom. Heat is not just outside. Heat has entered the structure. It has been stored there. The machine is not cooling an empty box. It is fighting the memory of the day. The same thing is happening across the grid. The power system is fighting the memory of the climate day. This is the human pathway. A dry basin reduces runoff. Reduced runoff weakens reservoir storage. Lower storage lowers Lake Mead. Lower Lake Mead reduces hydraulic head at Hoover. Reduced head changes hydropower output and turbine operating conditions. If the system approaches the low elevation zone, near 1,035 feet, some older turbines may not be counted on the same way because of cavitation risk. Less useful hydropower means less margin. Less margin means replacement power, higher costs, tighter planning, or reduced flexibility. Those pressures do not stay in a control room. They travel. They arrive as a utility decision. They arrive as a rate adjustment. They arrive as a peak alert. They arrive as a demand response request. They arrive as a thermostat choice. They arrive as a room. The body receives the final message, not as data, as heat. Heat changes the body before the person understands the system. The heart works harder to move blood toward the skin. Sweating uses water the body may not have enough of. Sleep becomes lighter. A person with heart disease, kidney disease, diabetes, respiratory illness, or limited mobility has less room for error. A child has a smaller body and less control over the environment. An older person may not feel thirst clearly enough. A worker who has already spent hours outside may come home with less reserve. The power system and the human body share one dangerous feature. Both depend on recovery. A grid needs recovery between peaks. A body needs recovery between heat exposures. A reservoir needs recovery between dry years. When recovery windows shrink, the next load arrives before the system is ready. That is why this story is not only about whether Hoover generates electricity today. It is about whether the region keeps enough flexible margin to protect the recovery window when heat keeps returning. In the apartment, the man does what millions of people do. He waits. He drinks water. He checks the thermostat. He keeps the blinds closed. He thinks about the bill. He remembers last month. He knows that each degree lower costs money. He knows that each degree higher makes sleep harder. He does not make this decision as a political argument. He makes it as a household calculation. Comfort is not the only issue. Cooling can be health infrastructure. For a person with medication that affects hydration, for someone using an oxygen machine, for an infant, for an elderly person living alone, for a worker who needs sleep before another outdoor shift, the difference between a room that cools and a room that stays hot can become medical. The body does not need a disaster declaration to enter stress. It only needs load that exceeds recovery. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside. This is how the lake crosses into the body. Not because one household is directly plugged into one turbine. The grid does not work that simply. Electricity is pooled, dispatched, balanced, bought, sold, transmitted, and regulated. But system pressures move through networks. When one flexible public power resource becomes weaker, the region must compensate. Compensation has costs. Costs and constraints are distributed unevenly. People with money buy better insulation, newer air conditioning, rooftop solar, batteries, efficient windows, or the ability to leave. People without money absorb more heat inside older buildings. That is the injustice hidden inside margin. A lost megawatt is not felt equally. A higher bill is not felt equally. A peak alert is not felt equally. A hot night is not felt equally. In a newer home with strong insulation and an efficient cooling system, the same grid stress may pass unnoticed. In an older apartment with a weak unit, poor ceiling, a west-facing wall, and a tenant afraid of the bill, the same stress becomes physical. The thermostat becomes a negotiation between money and health. That negotiation is not written in the reservoir report, but it begins upstream. The falling lake does not choose the apartment. The basin does not choose the worker. The turbine does not know who is vulnerable, but infrastructure risk always finds the people with the least buffer first. That is the human pathway, from low water into low margin, from low margin into higher stress, from higher stress into household decisions, from household decisions into the body. The man sits near the vent and waits for cooler air. The sound of the air conditioner becomes the sound of dependence. It is a small machine inside a large machine. Behind it is a feeder line, a substation, a balancing authority, a power market, a transmission system, a federal hydropower project, a dam, a reservoir, a river, a snowpack, and an atmosphere that no longer follows the old calendar reliably. A person does not need to see that chain to depend on it. Most infrastructure works best when it is invisible. The faucet turns, the light comes on, the room cools, the elevator moves, the hospital has power, the traffic signal changes, the water pump runs, the refrigerator stays cold. Life is organized around the assumption that these things will happen. Margin is the hidden promise inside that assumption. When margin shrinks, the promise becomes conditional. The grid may still work. The dam may still produce. The utility may still serve customers. The apartment may still cool, but each still carries more strain than before. Still is not the same as safe. Still is not the same as affordable. Still is not the same as resilient. That is the sentence the Lake Mead headline cannot hold. A reservoir below 1,050 feet may look like a water story. A forecast closer to 1,035 feet turns it into a machinery story. But when heat, demand, and replacement power enter the picture, it becomes a human story. The human story does not require panic. It requires tracing the load. The load begins in the atmosphere as heat and missing runoff. It moves into the basin as low storage. It moves into Hoover as falling head. It moves into turbines as reduced performance and cavitation concern. It moves into power planning as less flexible hydropower. It moves into utilities as replacement decisions. It moves into households as cost, comfort, and risk. It moves into the body as sleep, hydration, heart rate, and stress. That is the path, and every step has evidence behind it. Hydropower depends on head. Low reservoir elevation reduces head. Turbines have operating ranges. Cavitation can damage machinery. Hot regions need electricity for cooling. Households respond to price and heat. Human bodies need nighttime recovery. None of this needs to be exaggerated. The danger is in the connection. A person can survive a hot day if the night brings recovery. A grid can survive a peak if it has margin. A reservoir can survive a dry spell if the next season restores storage. But when the day stays hot, the night stays warm, the reservoir stays low, and the power system loses flexible support, recovery itself becomes the scarce resource. That is where the story becomes larger than one dam. The household is not a metaphor, it is the end point of an operating chain. The man in the apartment is not personally responsible for the Colorado River. He did not design Hoover. He did not negotiate water law. He did not decide turbine specifications. He did not set the snowpack. He did not create the demand curve, but he lives inside the result. So do millions of others. Some live in Las Vegas, some live in Phoenix, some live in Southern California, some live on tribal lands where water and power infrastructure have never been equally secure. Some work in farm communities where river deliveries, pumping costs, and heat exposure meet in the same season. Some are connected to Hoover Power directly through public systems. Others feel the broader market and grid effects indirectly. The pathway is not identical for everyone, but the structure is the same. A system loses margin, and people with less margin feel it first. That is why the story must move from the reservoir to the room. Without the room, the numbers stay abstract. 1,050 feet is a statistic. 1,035 feet is a threshold. 950 feet is a technical boundary. But inside the room, those numbers become a question. Will the system recover before the next load arrives? The man eventually feels the air cool. Maybe the grid holds. Maybe the utility had enough supply. Maybe replacement power was available. Maybe the bill will come later. Maybe nothing visible fails tonight. That is exactly why margin failure is easy to miss. The evening can pass without catastrophe, while the system still becomes weaker. The room can cool while the cost of cooling rises. The dam can generate while its usable turbine fleet narrows. The reservoir can remain above minimum power pool, while its power value declines. The body can survive the night, while its recovery is incomplete. A disaster does not always announce itself by breaking everything at once. Sometimes it arrives by making every normal function more expensive, more fragile, and more dependent on luck. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the human pathway. The lake is falling outside, the first real pressure may be felt indoors, and the next weak point is smaller than most people think. It is not the whole Colorado River. It is not the whole dam. It is not even the whole power plant. It is the older turbine inside the wall. The weak point is not the whole dam. That is the first correction the story needs. When people hear that Lake Mead is falling, they often picture Hoover Dam as a single object, a wall, a monument, a symbol of concrete strength. They imagine risk arriving at the dam all at once, as if the entire structure were either safe or unsafe, useful or useless, working or failing. But infrastructure rarely weakens that way. The weak point is smaller. It is not the concrete wall. It is not the tourist bridge. It is not the reservoir surface. It is not even the whole power plant. The weak point is the older turbine inside the wall. That is where a falling lake becomes a machine problem. That is where a reservoir number becomes an equipment limit. That is where 1,035 feet begins to matter more than the headline. Hoover Dam is massive enough to make people forget that it depends on parts. The dam looks permanent because the wall is permanent. It stands against the canyon with the confidence of another era. It does not look like something that can be made vulnerable by inches and feet on a water gauge. But the power system is not made of concrete alone. It is made of intakes, gates, penstocks, turbines, generators, transformers, switchyards, transmission lines, cooling systems, maintenance schedules, contracts, and operating rules. Each part has a job, each part has a range, each part has assumptions built into it. When the lake is high, those assumptions are easier to satisfy. When the lake is low, the parts begin to separate into groups. Some parts can still do the work, some can do less of the work, some can do the work only with higher cost or higher risk. According to a Bureau of Reclamation technical review, Hoover Dam has 5 wide head turbines that are better suited for low elevation operation. But the review also points to 12 older turbines that face concern from excessive cavitation damage if Lake Mead falls below 1,035 feet. That does not mean the dam suddenly stops. It means the available machine fleet changes. That is the weak point. 5 turbines are not 17 turbines. A narrowed machine fleet is not the same as a full power plant. The public sees Hoover as one dam. Operators see a set of units. Unit by unit, the dam's ability to make useful electricity depends on water, elevation, flow, mechanical condition, vibration, efficiency, cavitation risk, and the demand placed on the plant. This is why the phrase minimum power pool can mislead people. If Hoover can physically generate down to around 950 feet, then 1035 may sound like a comfortable cushion. It is still 85 feet higher than that lower boundary. It sounds as though the system has plenty of room, but the room is not only vertical, the room is operational. A power plant can be above minimum power pool and still lose usable capacity. It can be above minimum power pool and still run fewer units. It can be above minimum power pool and still produce less energy from the same water. It can be above minimum power pool and still face damage risk if the wrong machines are used under the wrong low head conditions. The real question is not only whether water can still reach the turbine, the question is whether the turbine should be run. That is a different kind of danger. A broken machine creates a visible problem. A machine withheld from operation to avoid damage creates an invisible one. Nothing explodes, nothing collapses. No dramatic image appears on the news. But the system has less capacity than people assume. The dam still stands, the river still moves, the grid still operates, yet the margin has quietly been removed. This is the kind of failure that hides inside the word available. A turbine can exist without being fully available. A generator can be installed without being the right unit to run. A power plant can have nameplate capacity that does not reflect what low water conditions allow at a given moment. Nameplate capacity is the number people remember. It is the maximum rating under defined conditions. Hoover's generating capacity is often described at more than 2,000 megawatts. That number is real, in the way a vehicle's top speed is real. But a vehicle on a damaged road, carrying weight, in high heat, with limited fuel, cannot be understood by its top speed alone. A dam at low reservoir elevation cannot be understood by nameplate capacity alone. The road has changed. The water is the road. At normal operation, water enters the intake towers and moves through the penstocks toward the turbines. The system controls how much water passes through and when. The turbine runner is shaped to receive moving water in a way that converts flow and pressure into rotation. The generator turns that mechanical rotation into electricity. The process looks steady from outside because the dam hides the violence of the conversion. Inside, water is moving fast. Pressure is changing. Metal is spinning. Forces are being managed. The machine is not simply touched by water, it is loaded by water. That loading has to stay inside acceptable limits. When the reservoir elevation falls, the turbine receives lower head. A turbine designed for one range of head may not perform well in another. Efficiency can drop, flow patterns can become less favorable, pressure zones can shift, cavitation risk can increase. The turbine may still spin, but the damage risk can rise enough that operators have to choose restraint over production. That restraint is the weak point becoming visible, not to tourists, to operators. The weak point is not weakness in the sense of bad maintenance or careless design. Hoover was built with extraordinary ambition and has been maintained through generations of engineering work. The older turbines are not weak because they were poorly made. They are vulnerable because the river system around them is being pulled into conditions that stress assumptions from another hydrologic era. A machine can be excellent and still be mismatched to a new operating range. That is one of the hardest infrastructure lessons in a changing climate. The problem is not always that the old system was badly built. The problem is that it was built for a different envelope. An envelope is the range of conditions a system expects. How much heat? How much flow? How much pressure? How much demand? How much recovery time? How much storage? How often extremes arrive? How long they last? How much margin exists between normal and unsafe? Hoover's older turbines were part of a system that assumed Lake Mead would usually provide stronger head than it does now. The Colorado River would have dry periods, but massive storage would buffer them. Water would fluctuate, but not remain so low for so long that power optimization had to be rewritten around low head constraints. Now the envelope is moving, the wall remains, the machines meet a different river. That is where the weak point begins to matter for people outside the dam. If 12 older turbines cannot be used the same way below 1,035 feet, then the power plant loses part of the flexibility that made it valuable. The question becomes, how many units can run, when they can run, what output they can provide, and whether they can meet the demand profile that customers expect. This is not only about annual energy, it is about capacity. Energy is the total amount produced over time. Capacity is the ability to produce at a given moment. A region can sometimes replace energy with purchases across a season. Capacity during a peak hour is harder. When heat pushes demand up across a large region, everyone may want the same replacement power at the same time. That is why hydropower margin matters. Hoover power is valuable not only because it is produced by water, it is valuable because it can help meet demand when scheduled and available. If low elevation reduces how much the plant can safely and economically provide, the missing capacity has to come from another source. That source may be a gas plant, it may be imports, it may be market power, it may be batteries, it may be demand response, it may be a combination. But every replacement has conditions. Gas depends on fuel and plant availability. Imports depend on transmission and whether neighboring regions have surplus. Market purchases depend on price and supply. Batteries depend on charge and duration. Demand response depends on people and institutions reducing use when asked. Replacement is possible. Replacement is not free. The weak point inside Hoover, therefore, does not stay inside Hoover. It moves outward through the power system as planning uncertainty. A utility that once expected a certain amount of federal hydropower may have to plan for less. A public power customer may face higher costs. A water agency that depends on electricity for pumping may see pressure in budgets. A community already paying for cooling, water treatment, and infrastructure may absorb another hidden cost. The turbine is small compared with the river, but it can decide how much of the river's stored energy becomes useful at the moment it is needed. That is why infrastructure weak points are often deceptively small. A transformer can determine whether a neighborhood has power. A pump can determine whether water reaches a pressure zone. A culvert can determine whether a road floods. A bridge joint can determine whether an evacuation route stays open. A valve can determine whether a hospital has water. A turbine can determine whether a dam's historical power value is still available under low water conditions. The weak point is the place where a large system becomes local. At Hoover, that place is spinning metal. When water hits a turbine runner under the right conditions, the system looks elegant. Gravity does the work. The reservoir supplies head, the turbine receives force, the generator turns, electricity flows. The entire process can seem almost clean and inevitable. But when conditions move out of range, the elegance becomes stress. The runner may see unfavorable pressure zones. Tiny vapor cavities may form. They may collapse against metal surfaces. Over time, the collapse can pit and eat away at the surface. Vibration can increase. Efficiency can decline. Maintenance risk grows. Operators have to decide whether the output is worth the wear. This is not the kind of risk that can be understood from a photograph of the dam. A photograph shows the wall. The weak point is in the water path. That water path is where engineering meets policy. Operators cannot simply run every unit because electricity is needed. They also have to preserve the equipment. A damaged turbine is not a short-term inconvenience only. It can mean outages, repairs, lost production, and higher long-term costs. It can remove capacity from the plant when the reservoir is already low. So the decision becomes a trade-off. Use the older unit and risk damage. Avoid using the older unit and lose capacity. Schedule generation when it is most valuable and conserve equipment. Buy replacement power and protect the machine. Spend money now to avoid worse losses later. Every choice costs something. This is what a margin failure looks like in real life. It is not one catastrophic break. It is a set of choices that all become worse at the same time. The water system has less storage. The power plant has less head. The older turbines have less safe operating range. The grid has less flexible federal hydropower. The customer has less protection from replacement costs. The household has less room between heat and affordability. All of it begins to concentrate around a part most people will never see. That is why the old turbine is the right weak point for this story. It is specific enough to be real. It is small enough to be missed. It is important enough to alter the larger system. A vague statement like infrastructure is vulnerable does not explain anything. This does. 12 older turbine units may not be counted on the same way under low head conditions because excessive cavitation damage becomes a concern. 5 wide head turbines can operate in a broader range, but 5 cannot carry the full expectation of 17. The result is not instant darkness. The result is narrower operating capability. That is the story. The dam does not disappear. The power margin shrinks. This distinction also helps keep the warning honest. It prevents the false image of Hoover Dam on the edge of collapse. It also prevents the opposite false comfort. the idea that nothing serious happens until Lake Mead reaches 950 feet. Both are wrong. The real risk lives between them. A system can be far from total failure and still be losing the function people rely on. A bridge does not have to collapse to become unusable for heavy trucks. A hospital does not have to close to become dangerously overcrowded. A power plant does not have to shut down to become less useful during peak demand. A reservoir does not have to be empty to lose hydropower value. That is the weak point logic. The weak point is not the end point. It is the place where performance begins to degrade. For Hoover, that degradation matters because the dam sits inside a region where the demand for reliable electricity is not shrinking. Air conditioning demand, water pumping, data systems, hospitals, transportation, refrigeration, and industry all depend on electricity arriving at the right time. The hotter the region becomes, the more valuable flexible power becomes. The lower Lake Mead falls, the harder it becomes for Hoover to provide that flexibility in the old way. This is the squeeze. Water stress reduces the asset that helps manage heat stress. Heat stress increases demand for the asset that water stress is weakening. That feedback does not require a blackout to be dangerous. It can show up as cost. It can show up as tighter resource plans. It can show up as emergency appeals. It can show up as deferred maintenance, becoming impossible to defer. It can show up as agencies discovering that the same infrastructure must now serve a climate it was not optimized for. Inside that squeeze, the turbine becomes more than a machine. It becomes a boundary between old assumptions and current conditions. The old assumption was that reservoirs created time. If one year was dry, storage helped carry the system. If demand rose, hydropower helped respond. If planning was difficult, the buffer gave managers options. Hoover and Mead were not just structures. They were a form of regional patience. Low water reduces patience. A low reservoir gives managers less time. A low reservoir gives machines less head. A low reservoir gives the grid less flexibility. A low reservoir gives negotiations less room. It forces decisions that once could be postponed. And when the weak point is a turbine, the time problem becomes physical. Metal cannot negotiate with drought. A contract can be amended. A forecast can be revised. A water user can be asked to conserve. A power customer can pay more. But turbine blades experience pressure directly. Cavitation does not wait for policy. If the conditions are wrong, the damage process begins at the surface of the machine. That is why the weak point is so unforgiving. It converts slow basin decline into immediate mechanical stress. The lake may fall by fractions of a foot. The policy debate may take months. The climate trend may unfold over decades. But inside the turbine, pressure conditions occur in real time. Every operating hour matters. Every decision to run or hold back carries consequences. This is where the story prepares us for history. Because cavitation is not imaginary. It is not a theoretical word placed in a federal appendix to sound technical. It is a physical process that has damaged real hydraulic structures before. Hoover itself has a history that shows what moving water can do when pressure, speed, and geometry combine in the wrong way. That does not mean the same event is happening again. It means the mechanism has a past. And history has already recorded what happens when water is treated as harmless because the concrete around it looks strong. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. Not the same event, not the same operating condition, not the same part of the dam, but the same physical warning is written into Hoover's own history. Moving water, when pressure, speed, surface shape, and geometry align badly, can become destructive even inside infrastructure built to master it. That is the precedent. In 1941, Hoover Dam was still young enough to belong to the age of triumph that built it. The dam had already become a symbol of American engineering. It held back the Colorado River. It stored Lake Mead. It generated power. It helped make the modern Southwest imaginable. The public image was a massive concrete wall, clean lines, towers, spillways, and the belief that engineering had finally put the river into order, but water has never been fully obedient. During high-flow testing and spillway operation, Hoover revealed something that concrete alone could not hide. Cavitation damage appeared in the spillway tunnels. The issue was connected to the way fast-moving water interacted with the tunnel surface and flow path. Reclamation later documented the damage and the repairs, including patching, polishing, and design modifications intended to control how the water behaved. That history matters because cavitation is easy to misunderstand. It sounds small, a bubble, a pocket of vapor, a tiny collapse. But cavitation is not harmless foam. In fast-moving hydraulic systems, vapor cavities can form where pressure drops, then collapse violently when pressure rises again. Each collapse is tiny. The damage comes from repetition. Millions of collapses near a surface can pit concrete, scar metal, and eat away at material that looks far stronger than the water touching it. The danger is not the bubble. The danger is the collapse. That is the connection to Hoover today. The 1941 spillway damage does not mean the turbines now face the same failure mode in the same place. It does not mean Lake Mead falling below 1,050 feet is equivalent to a spillway emergency. It does not mean the power plant is about to be destroyed. That would be a false comparison. History is not a prediction here. It is a warning label on the mechanism. The old spillway case proves something narrow but important. Cavitation is not theoretical. It is not just a word in a federal technical appendix. It is a real hydraulic damage process that has affected real structures, including Hoover. When engineers mention excessive cavitation damage, they are not inventing an abstract concern. They are naming a physical process with a record. That record changes how the present should be read. If a technical review says that 12 older Hoover turbines may face excessive cavitation damage below 1,035 feet, that sentence belongs to a long engineering memory. It is not theatrical language. It is the kind of cautious wording that comes from knowing what water can do when it moves through the wrong pressure range. The public sees water as soft. Engineers learn that moving water can be violent. A river does not need to be solid to destroy. It only needs speed, pressure change, repetition, and time. A spillway tunnel can be damaged. A pump impeller can be damaged. A ship propeller can be damaged. A turbine runner can be damaged. The material does not fail because water is heavy in a simple way. It fails because water behavior becomes concentrated into the wrong forces at the wrong surface. That is why the precedent belongs in this story. The current risk at Hoover is not about floodwater racing through the spillway. It is about low reservoir elevation changing the hydraulic conditions under which turbines operate. The direction of the stress is different, the location is different, the operational context is different, but the underlying lesson is the same. Hydraulic systems have limits. They do not care how iconic the structure is. They do not care how famous the dam is. They do not care how old the public expectation has become. If the conditions move outside the safe or efficient envelope, the machine responds. That is the piece history helps us see. Hoover's image can make risk feel impossible. The dam is too large, too familiar, too photographed, too woven into the identity of the Southwest. It has survived decades of operation, droughts, floods, policy fights, wars, growth, and generations of visitors. The mind looks at the wall and assumes endurance, but the weak point is not the wall. The weak point is the hydraulic pathway. That was true in the spillway precedent, and it is true in the turbine discussion now. The danger hides where moving water meets shaped infrastructure. In a spillway, that place is a tunnel, floor, curve, surface, or outlet structure. In a power plant, that place is the intake, penstock, wicket gate, runner, draft tube, and the pressure conditions around spinning metal. The material changes. The lesson stays. Water moving through infrastructure is not just passing through. It is testing the design. In 1941, the lesson arrived through damage that had to be repaired. Engineers studied the pattern. They treated the surfaces. They modified the way water left the structure. They learned from the fact that a massive dam could still contain a small hydraulic mistake with expensive consequences. That is the right way to use precedent, not to frighten people into thinking history repeats exactly, but to show that mechanisms repeat in families. A wildfire does not need to burn the same forest to show the same wind and fuel logic. A flood does not need to strike the same street to show the same drainage failure. A heat wave does not need to hit the same city to show the same nighttime recovery problem. A dam does not need to repeat the same spillway event to show that cavitation is a real form of hydraulic damage. The past shows the mechanism has teeth. The present shows where those teeth may touch next. That is why 1,035 feet cannot be treated as just another line in a document. It is tied to the operating range of actual turbines. Below that range, the issue is not a public symbol. It is the possibility that older units should not be used because the damage risk becomes too high. That is a very different warning from the old Hoover myth of unlimited control. For much of the 20th century, the Colorado River was treated as something a system could command. Dams would store it, canals would move it, turbines would monetize its fall, cities would grow around the confidence that storage created time. Agriculture would expand around the expectation that river deliveries could be scheduled. The dam was not only a structure, it was a promise that variability could be domesticated. The precedent says the promise was always conditional. Even at the height of confidence, the water still had to behave within the design. That is the humbling part of Hoover history. The dam was one of the boldest engineering projects of its era, yet engineers still had to learn from the behavior of water after construction. They had to observe damage, repair it, and change designs. The structure was strong, but strength did not eliminate the need to respect hydraulic detail. The same humility is needed now. Low water is not as visually dramatic as high-velocity spillway damage. It does not send giant flows through emergency structures. It does not create the same footage, but it is still a hydraulic condition. It still changes what water does when it reaches the machinery. It still forces operators to think in terms of pressure, efficiency, vibration, and damage risk. A dry reservoir can be as operationally serious as a violent release, but in a quieter way. The violent release breaks by force. The dry reservoir weakens by subtraction. It subtracts height. It subtracts pressure. It subtracts efficiency. It subtracts usable units. It subtracts confidence. That is the precedent translated into the current moment. Hoover once showed that fast water in the wrong hydraulic condition can damage structures. Now the concern is that low headwater in the wrong turbine condition can damage older machinery or make it unwise to run. The danger is not identical, but it belongs to the same engineering truth. Water systems fail at the interface between assumption and condition. The assumption may be that the flow path is smooth enough. The condition may reveal pressure changes no one can ignore. The assumption may be that the reservoir will stay high enough for normal power economics. The condition may reveal that low head has become the new operating constraint. The assumption may be that minimum power pool is the only number the public needs. The condition may reveal that power margin begins shrinking far above that lower line. This is the lesson that has not been absorbed enough. Infrastructure discussions often stay trapped between two extremes. Either the system is fine, or the system is collapsing. Either the dam is safe, or the dam is failing. Either the power plant works, or the power plant stops. Those categories are too crude for real infrastructure. Real systems degrade. They derate. They lose range. They require more maintenance. They lose cheap options. They force trade-offs. They continue operating while the margin disappears. That is what history teaches when it is read carefully. The past does not say Hoover will suffer the same damage again. It says the system deserves attention before damage becomes visible. It says engineers take thresholds seriously because thresholds are where physics starts taking choices away. It says a famous structure can contain hidden vulnerabilities in the path of water. And it says the public should not wait for a cinematic failure before understanding the risk. The current warning around Lake Mead is not cinematic. A falling reservoir does not produce a single dramatic sound. The daily gauge moves downward. The forecast tightens. The technical appendix names a lower number. The older turbines become a constraint. The power system adjusts. Replacement costs move outward. Most people continue with their day. That quietness is exactly why the precedent matters. Hoover's earlier cavitation damage was not proof that the entire dam was weak. It was proof that a powerful system can be vulnerable at specific points. The lesson was not abandon the dam. The lesson was understand the mechanism, repair the damage, and modify the design. The present needs the same discipline. Do not exaggerate the risk. Do not dismiss it. Read the mechanism. A reservoir below 1,050 feet is not the same as a turbine failure. A forecast near 1,035 feet is not the same as total power loss. Minimum power pool near 950 feet still matters. The dam remains a working structure. The grid has other resources. Operators have tools. But the evidence is enough to say this clearly. The Southwest is approaching a power constraint that lives inside water elevation, machine design, and regional demand at the same time. That is not speculation. That is system analysis. The precedent does one more thing. It reminds us that problems discovered in one part of the water system often reveal a larger pattern. The spillway damage was not only about a damaged surface, It was about learning that water behavior under extreme conditions could exceed the assumptions of design. The current low water concern is not only about older turbines, it is about learning that the climate and hydrology around Hoover are moving the power plant into conditions that were once easier to avoid. The river has changed the test. For decades, the test was how to store and release a river that varied from year to year. Now the test is how to operate a river system when low storage, heat, power demand, legal obligations, aging infrastructure, and uncertain recovery arrive together. That is the bridge from precedent to pattern. History tells us the mechanism can cause damage. The present tells us the mechanism is entering a wider system already short of margin, and the future question is no longer whether Hoover Dam is impressive enough to endure. The future question is whether the operating system around it can adapt before the next threshold becomes normal. This is not only a drought, it is a calendar failure inside an operating system. That is the larger pattern Lake Mead is exposing. The reservoir is low, but the deeper problem is that the old sequence of preparation, storage, release, generation, demand, and recovery is no longer arriving in the order the system was built around. For most of the modern Southwest, the Colorado River system has functioned like a giant calendar. Winter stored water in mountain snow. Spring turned some of that snow into runoff. Reservoirs captured the runoff. Summer drew down stored water for cities, farms, power generation, and heat. Autumn brought a pause. The next winter began the cycle again. That calendar was never perfect. The Colorado River has always been variable. There were wet years, dry years, floods, droughts, legal disputes, engineering surprises, and ecological damage. The system was not stable in the simple way people sometimes imagine the past, but the infrastructure was built around the belief that large storage could turn variability into manageability. Dams would hold the river until people needed it. Reservoirs would create time. Hydropower would capture value as water moved downhill. Legal rules would divide use. Engineering would smooth the rough edges of nature. The problem now is that the rough edges are no longer staying at the edge. They are entering the operating core. Lake Mead below 1,050 feet is one symptom. A forecast moving toward 1,035 feet is another. Low total system storage is another. A basin still negotiating rules for the period after the current guidelines is another. Heat-driven electricity demand is another. Aging equipment designed for a different hydrologic envelope is another. Each signal matters by itself. Together, they describe the new pattern. The basin is losing recovery time. Recovery time is the most important resource that does not appear in a simple lake-level headline. Water systems need time to refill. Power systems need time to restore margin after peak demand. Infrastructure needs time for maintenance. Legal systems need time to negotiate new rules. Households need time to recover from heat. Farms need time to plan planting, irrigation, labor, and harvest. Cities need time to build conservation programs, reuse systems, storage projects, and emergency responses. When the river calendar worked better, time was easier to find. A dry year could be absorbed by storage. A hot week could be balanced by power resources. A difficult negotiation could lean on the fact that reservoirs still had buffer. Maintenance could be scheduled around more forgiving conditions. A shortage could be framed as a future risk. Now the future keeps arriving early. That is what makes the current Lake Mead signal larger than a water story. The reservoir is not simply low at the end of an isolated dry spell. It is low after years in which the system has already spent much of its stored patience. Lake Powell has had to be protected. Lake Mead has remained under pressure. Lower basin users have had to face shortage conditions. Federal agencies have had to manage releases with less room. States have had to negotiate reductions while the river kept changing underneath them. The old calendar assumed sequence. The new pattern creates overlap. Drought overlaps with heat. Heat overlaps with power demand. Power demand overlaps with low hydropower head. Low hydropower head overlaps with turbine constraints. Turbine constraints overlap with replacement power costs. Replacement power costs overlap with household vulnerability. Household vulnerability overlaps with the next heat event. This is compound risk. Not because every element is caused by the same thing in a simple line, not because one low lake reading explains every pressure across the Southwest, but because separate pressures are beginning to arrive together and use the same margins: a water margin, a power margin, a financial margin, a health margin, a political margin, a maintenance margin, When these margins shrink at the same time, the system becomes harder to manage even without a single catastrophic failure. This is what Lake Mead is showing. The reservoir was supposed to be the buffer. Now the buffer itself needs a buffer. That is the abnormal system pattern. For water managers, the pattern appears as a choice between bad trade-offs. Holding more water in Lake Powell may help protect upstream operations, including Glen Canyon Dam's own hydropower and delivery concerns. But holding water upstream can reduce what moves down to Mead. Sending more water downstream can help Mead, but it may weaken Powell. Cutting lower basin use can preserve storage, but it affects farms, cities, tribes, industries, and communities whose economies were built around the river. Waiting for a wet year may help, but only if the wet year arrives as usable runoff and not as a temporary relief that disappears into dry soil, heat, and demand. For power planners, the pattern appears as a change in confidence. Hoover Dam is still a powerful asset, but its value depends on reservoir elevation, head, usable turbines, and timing. The system does not only need annual electricity, it needs capacity at specific hours. It needs flexibility when demand rises. It needs resources that can help balance the grid when other supplies are variable, expensive, or constrained. A low reservoir reduces that confidence. It forces the question nobody wants at the hour of peak demand: what replaces the margin? For cities, the pattern appears as infrastructure stress. Water treatment, pumping, distribution, wastewater systems, cooling centers, hospitals, transit, traffic signals, data centers, schools, and emergency services all depend on electricity and water in different ways. A city can conserve water and still need power to pump what remains. A city can add solar and still need evening resources when heat remains after sunset. A city can plan for drought and still be surprised when the drought also becomes a power economics problem. For agriculture, the pattern appears as timing. Irrigation is not only a volume issue, it is a calendar issue. A farm needs water during a window when crops can use it. Too little water at the wrong time can be more damaging than the same shortage spread differently. If pumping power becomes more expensive or less certain, water stress and energy stress meet inside the same planting decision. A field does not experience river law as an abstract agreement. It experiences it as whether water and money arrive before the crop window closes. For tribes, the pattern carries another layer. Many tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin have senior water rights, unresolved infrastructure needs, and long histories of exclusion from the systems that allocated the river's benefits. When the basin tightens, the question is not only how to reduce use, it is who had access to water infrastructure in the first place, who benefited from the old assumptions, and who is asked to absorb risk now. A shrinking river does not erase old inequities, it often exposes them. For households, the pattern becomes cost and heat. A utility can replace some missing hydropower, a city can buy power, a grid can import electricity, a public agency can revise budgets. But replacement power has a price, and prices move through institutions until they reach people. Some households can absorb that, others cannot. In a heat-stressed region, an energy cost is not only a financial number, it can become a health decision. That is why the Lake Mead signal has to be read as a system expansion. The falling lake is not moving toward one impact, it is moving toward many doors at once. One door leads to water deliveries, one door leads to hydropower, one door leads to grid planning, one door leads to replacement power, one door leads to household cooling, one door leads to agricultural timing, one door leads to tribal infrastructure justice, one door leads to the rules that will govern the river after 2026. The same reservoir level reaches each door differently. That is why old preparation calendars are failing. The system used to separate problems by category. Water agencies handled water, power agencies handled power, public health agencies handled heat, emergency managers handled crisis response, agricultural districts handled irrigation, federal agencies handled dam operations and river accounting. Those divisions still exist, but the stresses are becoming less obedient. A low reservoir is a water issue until it reduces hydropower. Reduced hydropower is a power issue until it raises costs. Higher costs are an economic issue until they affect cooling. Cooling is a household issue until heat becomes medical. Medical stress is a public health issue until hospitals need power and water. Hospitals are infrastructure until the grid is tight. The categories collapse into each other. That is the system pattern, and it is not limited to Hoover. Across the world, climate-stressed infrastructure is revealing the same kind of overlap. Heat waves become grid tests. Floods become drainage failures. Droughts become food price shocks. Wildfires become air quality emergencies. Low rivers become shipping constraints and power plant cooling problems. Wet snow becomes distribution line damage. Storm surge becomes hospital evacuation. The event is visible in one place. The failure appears somewhere else. Lake Mead is the southwest version of that pattern. The visible event is a falling reservoir. The hidden failure is operating margin. The old baseline said the river could be managed through storage large enough to bridge dry periods. The new baseline is not that the river has no water. That would be too simple. The new baseline is that storage, demand, heat, equipment, law, and recovery are now interacting under tighter conditions more often. That is harder to manage than a single shortage. A single shortage can be allocated. A system pattern has to be redesigned. The phrase new baseline is dangerous if it is used carelessly. It can make people think the future is a straight line, as if every year will be worse than the last in a neat sequence. That is not how river systems work. There will still be wet years. Storms will still arrive. Snowpack will sometimes improve. Reservoirs can rise. Policy can change. Conservation can work. Infrastructure can be upgraded. Demand can shift. The system is not frozen into decline. But a wet year does not automatically restore the old calendar. That is the key. A reservoir can rise and still remain vulnerable if long-term demand, heat, evaporation, legal overuse and operating thresholds remain unresolved. A strong runoff season can provide relief without rebuilding all lost storage. A policy agreement can buy time without changing the physical river. A turbine upgrade can improve performance without solving basin-wide water imbalance. A household rebate can help cooling costs without protecting the reservoir. Recovery is possible. Return to the old assumptions is not guaranteed. That is the difference. The system was built for a river whose average flow was overestimated by early agreements and whose variability was supposed to be managed by storage. It was built for growth that treated water and power as foundations. It was built for a 20th century vision of command, expansion, and engineering confidence. Hoover Dam was one of the great monuments of that vision. Now the 21st century test is different. The question is not whether the dam is impressive. It is whether the operating model around the dam can still keep up. Can the basin reduce, use fast enough to preserve storage? Can rules after 2026 match the physical river instead of old political expectations? Can hydropower equipment adapt to lower reservoir elevations? Can the grid replace lost flexibility without increasing vulnerability during heat? Can cities protect low-income households from the cost of adaptation? Can farms survive new water timing without simply transferring damage to workers, food systems, or rural economies? Can tribal rights and infrastructure needs be addressed as central issues rather than afterthoughts? Can the system recover before the next load arrives? That last question is the echo from every earlier part of the story. The reservoir needs recovery. The turbine needs safe operating conditions. The grid needs margin. The body needs cooling. The policy system needs time. The region is running short on all of them at once. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means the old way of measuring safety is no longer enough. A lake can be above minimum power pool and still be a power risk. A dam can be structurally sound and still lose value. A grid can stay online and still become more expensive and fragile. A city can grow and still be building on borrowed margin. A household can keep the air conditioner running and still be one bill away from choosing discomfort. This is the new grammar of system risk. The verb is not always fail. Sometimes the verb is narrow. The options narrow, the safe range narrows, the affordable choices narrow, the recovery window narrows. The future narrows until a number that once looked technical becomes a public condition. That is why the Lake Mead headline matters even for people who will never visit the reservoir. It shows how a climate signal travels through engineered assumptions. It shows how a water gauge becomes a power question. It shows how a hydropower threshold becomes a household problem. It shows how a dam built to create certainty can become evidence that certainty itself is being renegotiated. The map shows a lake. The system shows a schedule slipping. The old schedule said winter stores, spring releases, summer uses, autumn resets. The new schedule says heat arrives earlier, Runoff is less reliable, storage remains low, demand stays high, negotiations lag behind physics, and machinery has to operate closer to thresholds it was not supposed to meet so often. That is a calendar failure, not a failure of one date, a failure of timing itself. In this pattern, the most dangerous period may not be the day a threshold is crossed. It may be the months before, when everyone can still say the system is functioning, the dam is still generating, the lake still has water, the grid still serves demand, the contracts still exist, the agencies still publish reports, the evening still passes, but the margin is being spent. And once margin is spent, the next event does not have to be extreme by old standards to create a crisis. A heat wave that would once have been manageable can become dangerous. A dry year that would once have been buffered can force harder cuts. A turbine constraint that would once have been a technical concern can become a regional power issue. A high bill that would once have been inconvenient can become a health risk. The baseline has shifted because the buffer has shrunk. That is the pattern the system is trying to tell us. Lake Mead is not simply sliding down a canyon wall. It is moving through the assumptions of a river civilization. It is asking whether storage can still provide time, whether hydropower can still provide flexibility, whether law can still allocate what physics no longer supplies, and whether households can still afford the systems that protect them from heat. This is not only a falling lake, this is a hydropower margin failure. And beyond that, it is a warning about any infrastructure system built around a climate calendar that no longer holds. The evidence is strong enough to take seriously. But the final step is to draw the line carefully. What is proven? What is related? What is only happening at the same time? What is not yet known? And what future risk remains even if the next weekly report looks slightly better? That boundary matters, because the warning does not need exaggeration. The truth is already heavy enough. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. That is the line this story has to hold. A falling Lake Mead is serious. A lower Hoover power margin is serious. A forecast moving closer to 1,035 feet is serious. Older turbines facing cavitation risk under low head conditions is serious. But serious does not mean every dramatic claim is true. Serious does not mean the dam is about to fail. Serious does not mean every power problem in the southwest can be traced to one lake level. The truth is narrower than panic, and stronger. What is proven is this. Bureau of Reclamation operating data showed Lake Mead slipping below 1,050 feet at Hoover Dam. Federal hydrologic updates placed the reservoir lower in June and projected it closer to 1,037 feet by the end of the calendar year. Reclamation technical analysis identifies 1,035 feet as an important hydropower operating point. Below that level, the 5 wide head turbines remain the usable low head group, while 12 older turbines may face excessive cavitation damage risk. That is the evidence line. It says Lake Mead is low. It says Hoover's power system is moving closer to a more constrained operating zone. It says the issue is not only water quantity. It says the issue is hydraulic head, turbine suitability, economic value, and grid margin. But it does not say Hoover Dam is collapsing. It does not say Lake Mead is empty. It does not say power ends at 1,050 feet. It does not say 1,035 feet is the same as zero generation. It does not erase the minimum power pool near 950 feet. It does not prove that every future rate change, grid alert, power purchase, or household bill increase is caused by Lake Mead alone. That distinction matters. Without it, the story becomes noise. With it, the story becomes a warning. The public often wants a single, clean sentence. Either Hoover is fine, or Hoover is dying. Either the lake is usable, or the lake is gone. Either the grid is safe, or the grid is failing. But real infrastructure does not live inside those easy categories. Real infrastructure loses performance before it loses existence. It loses margin before it fails. It becomes more expensive, more constrained, and harder to operate while still appearing normal from far away. That is what Lake Mead is revealing. The dam still stands. The power plant still exists. The river still moves. The grid still operates. But the assumptions around all of them are becoming less comfortable. That is the correct emotional center of this story. Not panic, not relief, recognition. A system built to convert stored river height into power is being pulled into a low elevation range where that conversion becomes harder. A reservoir built to provide buffer is now part of the stress. A dam, built as a symbol of command, is becoming a test of adaptation. A river system designed around old timing is being forced to operate under new timing. This is not just a falling lake, this is a hydropower margin failure. And margin failure is easy to underestimate because it can happen while everything still appears to work. An evening can pass without a blackout. A household can still cool. A utility can still buy replacement power. A dam can still generate. A reservoir can still sit above minimum power pool. A report can still look like routine data. But each of those sentences contains the same hidden word, still. Still is where the risk hides. Still working means the system has not failed. It does not mean the system is healthy. Still generating means electricity is being produced. It does not mean the same amount of useful, flexible power is available. Still, above minimum power pool means the final lower boundary has not been reached. It does not mean earlier operating thresholds are harmless. Still, passing the evening means the load was met. It does not mean the cost, risk, and strain did not increase underneath the surface. That is why the opening signal matters. In early June, the federal table showed Lake Mead below 1,050 feet. On its own, that number could be treated as another reservoir milestone. But the story changed when the number was placed beside the lower forecast, the system storage condition, the turbine threshold, and the human demand curve of a hot region. One signal was the lake, the second was the forecast, the third was the machine, the fourth was the grid, the fifth was the room. Together, they describe a system losing room to maneuver. The line between related and proven must stay clear. Long-term warming, aridification, drought, over-allocation, reservoir operations, legal rules, evaporation, demand, and runoff variability all belong in the Colorado River story. But a single low reading at Lake Mead does not explain everything by itself. A single threshold does not predict a single outcome. A single dam does not define the entire western grid. The river is more complex than that. The power system is more complex than that. The evidence is more careful than that. But complexity is not comfort. Complexity means the risk travels through many pathways at once. It travels through upstream snowpack and runoff. It travels through Lake Powell release decisions. It travels through Lake Mead elevation. It travels through Hoover's hydraulic head. It travels through turbine availability. It travels through public power contracts. It travels through replacement energy. It travels through heat-driven demand. It travels through household decisions. It travels through the body. That chain does not require every link to fail. It only requires enough links to tighten at the same time. And they are tightening. That is the future echo. The event will pass. A weekly report may improve. A storm season may bring relief. A wet year may lift the lake. A policy agreement may reduce pressure. Turbine upgrades may improve operating range. Conservation may preserve storage. The future is not a straight line into collapse, and it should not be described that way. But the thing this event revealed will remain. A system built around old hydrologic timing is being tested by water, machines, heat, and demand arriving out of order. That is the message behind the reservoir gauge. The old assumption said storage would create time, but low storage means less time. The old assumption said hydropower would provide flexible value, but low head means less value. The old assumption said thresholds were far enough apart to give managers room, but 1,050 feet is now visible, 1,035 feet is no longer abstract, and 950 feet can no longer be treated as the only number that matters. The old assumption said the river could be managed mainly as a water supply system, but the river is also a power system, a food system, a tribal rights system, a municipal growth system, a public health system, and a climate risk system. That is why the question has changed. It is no longer only how low Lake Mead can go, it is how much operating margin the region can lose before normal life becomes more expensive, less reliable, and more dependent on emergency adaptation. The answer will not appear in one headline. It will appear in small changes, a reduced generation estimate, a revised operating plan, a power purchase, a higher cost, a peak demand warning, a maintenance constraint, a delayed recovery, a household choosing between cooling and money, a farm recalculating water and power costs, a city planning around less certainty, a public agency discovering that the old buffer is no longer large enough to protect every promise made around it. That is how system risk enters the future, not only as disaster footage, but as narrowing choices. The choice is narrow for operators who have to protect both Powell and Mead, They narrow for power planners who have to replace flexible hydropower. They narrow for utilities trying to serve hot evenings. They narrow for households with old air conditioners and high bills. They narrow for farmers who need water and energy at the right time. They narrow for tribal communities still fighting for infrastructure that should have been built long ago. They narrow for policymakers who have to write river rules after 2026 while the river itself refuses to wait. The future will not be decided only by the peak number. It will be decided by whether the system still has time to recover before the next load arrives. That is true for Lake Mead. It is true for Hoover's turbines. It is true for the grid. It is true for the body. Recovery is the quiet word underneath the entire story. A reservoir needs enough inflow to recover storage. A turbine needs operating conditions that avoid damage. A grid needs enough margin after a peak. A household needs a night cool enough to sleep. A body needs time to shed heat. A region needs policy fast enough to meet physics before physics removes the easy options. When recovery fails, the next stress does not have to be historic to be dangerous. It only has to arrive before the system is ready. That is the final lesson from the operations dashboard. The daily table did not scream, it did not need to. It simply showed the lake lower than before. The weekly update did not turn the river into prophecy. It placed storage, forecast, and elevation on the same page. The technical review did not describe apocalypse. It described machine limits. The documents are calm. The implication is not. A calm report can contain a severe warning if the system behind it is losing margin. That is why the story has to end where it began, with the official signal, a federal operations table, a reservoir elevation, a number below 1,050 feet, a forecast closer to 1,035, a dam whose power risk is worse than the shoreline suggests. The number on the gauge is visible, the margin inside the system is not, but the invisible number may decide more. It may decide which turbines can run. It may decide how much useful power Hoover can provide. It may decide how much replacement power must be found. It may decide how much cost moves outward. It may decide whether a hot evening remains routine or becomes a stress test. Lake Mead will continue to rise and fall. The river will still have wet periods and dry periods. Hoover Dam will remain one of the most important hydraulic structures in the United States. None of that cancels the warning. The warning is that the old distance between concern and constraint has shortened. The system is closer to the machine limits now, closer to the grid margin now, closer to the household now. The shoreline is only the first visible clue. The deeper story is the loss of vertical advantage inside a system that still expects old performance. So when the next Lake Mead number appears, do not only ask whether the lake is higher or lower than last week. Ask what that elevation means for head. Ask what it means for turbine range. Ask what it means for hydropower value. Ask what it means for the grid hour when demand peaks. Ask what it means for the people who cannot easily buy their way out of heat. Because the future of this system will not be measured only in feet of water. It will be measured in feet of lost margin. The event will pass, but the thing it revealed will remain. A river system built around old assumptions is being tested by a world no longer following the old calendar. And the next warning may not come from a dramatic failure. It may come from another quiet federal table, another lowered forecast, another turbine limit, another evening when the room takes longer to cool.